You're listening to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor, powered by bbbgive.org. Here we explore the motivations that form the basis of giving and service. We inspire generosity and celebrate the transformative effects that giving and service have on the human spirit and on community. The conversations featured on the podcast also uncover giving strategies that educate and provide tools to help listeners make impactful gifts of both their time and money. We hope you enjoy this episode.
This is the Heart of Giving podcast, powered by bbbgive.org. Give.org is the nation's standards-based charity evaluator, and it's your one-stop source for information on giving and reports on the most asked about charities. I'm Art Taylor. About a year ago, I had a chance to talk with my good friend, Phil Buchanan, who is the CEO of the Center for Effective Philanthropy. And as always, when I connect with Phil, we had a wide-ranging conversation about a number of issues that I commend that particular show to you to check out. But I'm happy to have him back today, this time joined with a colleague, Grace Nicolette, one of his colleagues at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. And the two of them host Giving Done Right, which is a podcast, another show that I certainly commend to you to check out. And they have a new season coming up. This is the fourth season. We started our podcast, interestingly, probably a week or so apart, maybe like the same week almost, about 4 years ago. And it's so interesting that we've both survived. But I think it kind of goes to show you the importance of getting information out. My docket continues to be filled with people who want to tell their stories. And I'm sure, given Series 4, that there are so many stories that you wish you had time to tell that you won't have the opportunity to. But anyway, let me just welcome Phil and Grace to the show and thank them for joining us today.
Thanks for having us, Art. It's
great to be with you.
Well, we want to talk about a number of things today, and I'd like to start with the podcast itself. Maybe you can both give us some idea of what we're going to see in this season.
Sure, I can start. We say that Giving Done Right is a show with everything you need to know to make an impact with your charitable giving. And as you said, this is our fourth season. It's actually the largest season we will have had, and with 16 episodes. So, the last 3 seasons we've learned a lot, and there seems to be a lot of interest for more of these conversations around what does it mean to be a good and thoughtful and effective giver. The tools and the inspiration and the stories, as well as just really practical kind of ideas on how to be better at giving. So we're super excited about the new season.
I would just add that we're nowhere near as prolific as you are, because I looked at the number of episodes you've done in the same amount of time that we've been doing our podcast, and it made me feel that we need to step it up, because you really have been so prolific, and I love your show. We have a lot of fun. I sometimes worry that are we doing this just because it's fun, or are we really reaching people? But I think we are reaching people, we've heard, and in this season, like Grace mentioned, we have a range of really interesting guests. The first 2 episodes, one is with Darren Walker, where we ask him, the president of the Ford Foundation, of course, who's recently announced that he's stepping down. And Grace asked him some really interesting questions right up front about what are your biggest accomplishments? What are your biggest regrets? And what can others learn from those? So that was fun. And the other episode that we'll put out on the launch day is with Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, who's a climate activist who has a new book out called What If We Get It Right? And we don't that often go deep in a particular area, but we do sometimes. And climate affects everything. And so we really wanted to highlight her work. But as I think about the podcast, Grace and I were talking about like what themes keep coming up, again and again. And in a way they sound obvious, but there's like so much that you got to get underneath. It's about, humility is a huge one. To be effective as a donor, you got to be humble. You got to be a good listener. You're not going to get anything done by yourself, so you got to collaborate. That keeps coming up again and again. You got to be both bold and patient, which is hard to do at the same time. Have to invest in nonprofit leaders and their staff if you really want to make a difference. You got to understand these cross-cutting issues like climate and racial justice that are sort of intersectional. And then the other thing that has been really fun to see is we will often talk with people who are part of a family, and sometimes we'll talk to a couple of family members together, the way in which money can actually bring people together rather than push them apart, family members, if the focus is on how to distribute it to make a difference in the world. So those are some of the themes that come up for us again and again, and certainly in this season of the podcast.
That's great. Grace, you've been with the center for how long now?
It'll be 13 years really soon.
13 years.
Mm-hmm.
See, I thought it was a pretty significant chunk of time.
Yes.
And what is it that, well, probably Phil is the thing that maybe kept you there, but what is maybe I'll say he got you.
It's in spite of me.
He got you there.
It's in spite of me.
No, it's
yeah. What is it about the work that kept you there?
Yeah, it is the longest place I've worked, and I've worked in a number of places. It's also obviously the best place that I've worked. And Phil is part of that. Our colleagues that we get to work with, many of whom have actually been there longer than me, are also part of that. And just together, we've built a really special culture and an organization that I feel really proud of. And, I keep learning new things. And so, I think that it keeps things really fresh. And so, super excited that my tenure has been so long.
And your role has evolved, right? I think you started out in one
That's
job.
right.
Now you're doing.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
I started out on our assessments and advisory services team as like an engagement manager, basically working with foundations that have done our assessments and going out to present their, results of their grantee surveys and, donor surveys for community foundations. And that is such an amazing experience, right? Getting to be in the boardrooms of foundations, hearing kind of what they're wrestling with, what they're thinking about. And eventually I transitioned into my current role, which is leading up our programs and external relations, which is a lot of hats. It's marketing communications, it's partnerships, external relations, it's fundraising, it's putting on our events, and then obviously it's getting to do fun things like this, co-hosting a podcast with Phil. And so, it's been really neat to have kind of seen many parts of the organization and been a part of it.
Well, of all the things you mentioned, the podcast is definitely, from my perspective, the most fun. I don't do fundraising well.
Right.
All marketing, I'm terrible at. All of those things you mentioned, I was just like, wow, But I can do a podcast. I like talking to people in our sector.
It is fun.
So, but you're covering some pretty important work over there, and obviously you're doing well because the organization's doing well.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just ask Phil. Phil, you mentioned who's listening. I don't know who's listening, but I do it because I think there's so many stories out there that need to be told. Now, I'm not suggesting anybody do what I do. I'm kind of nutty in that we do this every week. But, the idea that there's no end to the stories and the kinds of work that people are trying to do, sometimes great, sometimes good, sometimes really sketchy. Those stories are ones that I like to tell and like to have out there. And there's so much innovation going on in our sector, too, that people don't recognize. People kind of think nonprofits are doing the same thing they used to do. It's somewhat true, but it's not completely true. It doesn't tell a whole story about some of the real innovators in our sector that we've had a chance to talk to. Let me ask you, from your perspective, you're covering a lot about philanthropy, people who are thinking about giving money away. What are some of the more interesting trends or ideas that you're seeing now that should be talked about here today?
Well, I'll pick one and then let Grace maybe chime in with a different one. I mean, I think one of the really interesting approaches that we've highlighted now twice on the podcast is direct cash transfers to people in poverty. And lots of folks know Give Directly, and we had Paul Niehaus, the co-founder of Give Directly, on an earlier season. This season, we talked with Jesus Herrera, who is the leader of Up Together, which is doing direct cash transfers in a domestic context. And there's just growing evidence that if you want to help people in poverty, you just put money in their pocket and they're going to make good decisions to help change the trajectory of their lives. And so we've really enjoyed just helping raise that up. Grace, I don't know what comes to mind for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there have been many people in our sector who've talked over the years about how important it is for donors to get proximate to the causes and communities they care about. So Brian Stevenson of Equal Justice Initiative talks about that a lot. And I think that COVID really highlighted to a lot of people just how there are disproportionate effects on certain communities, whether due to systemic racism or other reasons. And so there really, I think, has been more of an understanding that I hope continues, that it's actually close. It's really important to get close and listen well to those you're seeking to support, and really see the importance of folks who are on the front lines, right, of those communities serving them. So nonprofits, other community leaders, they are in a great position to know what that community needs. And, we need to approach giving and, with a listening and humble posture.
For sure. There's a group out, by the way, I need to get them on here one day, called Feedback Labs, that I've been connected to as one of their advisors. And it's interesting that more groups now are beginning to focus on how you get direct feedback from people you're serving to help produce better programming, better support them, right? You can't really do it unless you understand what they need and directly from them.
Mark, can I just say something else about that issue?
Sure.
Which is, we're all about feedback, and we're probably best known for our surveys of nonprofits that lead to something called a grantee perception report that allows foundations to understand how they're being experienced by nonprofits.
Yeah.
But when we worked with the Gates Foundation back in 2006, 2007, and we've worked with them many times since, they said to us, well, why don't you help us actually hear from the people whose lives we're trying to improve? Not just from the nonprofits. That's been really valuable, but take it a step further. And a whole series of conversations that led to the creation of something that we run out of CEP called Youth Truth, youthtruth.org, separately branded because it's serving both education funders, but also school districts. But it's serving young people in upper elementary, middle school, and high school. And we also have a family survey and a staff survey for schools. And this has been hugely powerful in informing education leaders about how schools are actually being experienced, and in informing education funders, because it turns out, and this shouldn't surprise us, that in order to do well, young people have to feel a certain way, right? And there's actually a link that we see in our research, and others have shown in their research, between student perceptions and student performance and student outcomes. So we're providing this early indicator of how things are going. And it's been an incredibly valuable data set. And I think we've surveyed now, pretty much as of today, 3 million students and worked in most states across the country.
That's great. I mean, I think, again, you're right on. And hearing from people who are actually needing help, it seems like a basic idea. And it's good to see that is getting more and more attention. Let me talk a little bit about the sector, though, and the people in the sector. One of the things we hear a lot about, and we are not quite addressing it, in my opinion, maybe the way that we should. Although, in my case, my board followed your board, Phil, in allowing us to get sabbaticals. After I was about 21 years, I went to the board and said, I love what I'm doing, but it'd be great if I had some time off. And they gave it to me, 4 months, with pay, and I could go out and do what I wanted to do, and came back very refreshed. But, there's a lot going on in our sector around this concept of burnout. And we are struggling, I think, in some cases to find people to do jobs because of that. And what work have you all done on this whole issue?
I mean, I can start and say we launched a survey that we do every year now in 2023. So it's just been twice, but it'll be something we continue to do, called State of Nonprofits. And we ask a series of questions of nonprofit leaders. And the purpose is to educate donors about what do they need to know about what the pain points are, what's going on for nonprofits. And what comes out in both the 2023 as well as this year's results is that burnout is a huge issue. The burnout of staff, so leaders being concerned about the burnout of their teams, but also their own burnout. And increasingly so, they're concerned about their own burnout as well. And more broadly, just like staffing challenges are the biggest pain point for nonprofit leaders across organizations. So that's about burnout, but it's also about related issues like, can we pay enough for people to be able to live in this area? It's about being under-resourced. It's about having project restricted grants, but not general operating support, and not multi-year grants. So it's difficult to be able to plan and staff accordingly. So we've been just trying, and there are many other organizations, Fund the People, independent sector, to name just a few. There's a whole slew of organizations that are trying to raise up this issue so that we can actually give the resources to nonprofit leaders that they need to be effective, rather than constraining them as we expect them to do this important work, and then we don't always give them what they really need.
Yeah. Grace, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the findings just show what a pervasive issue it is. And I think that there are things that donors and the sector need to be aware of that can be done. It's not like it's intractable, but it's not impossible, right? And I think we might know what some of those things are. It's just a matter of whether or not we can act on them. One, which is, really providing nonprofits with unrestricted support, so that they are not hand to mouth with their funding. And, investing in the talent pipeline for the sector, I think, is really important too, right? You want your smartest and best people working on the most intractable problems that we have. What's the future and the vision that we're casting for them for being in the sector long term? And I love that you shared about the sabbatical that you had. We also have a sabbatical policy, as you know, and both Phil and I have taken sabbaticals at different times, and it was transformational, not just for me individually and for my family, but also we worked smarter. Like after I returned, right? Like the team had to adapt, people grew, and they stepped into things, and so there were just so many like primary and secondary benefits to that. And I think sometimes we just don't allow folks to build in that kind of margin and rest and realize that actually it's better for the work long term if we think about it that way versus squeezing every last drop out of folks.
Yeah. Grace, let me stay with you on this whole question of marketing, which is your role now here at CEP. I would argue that two of the biggest expenses that, well, I won't say biggest, but two of the expenses that have increased the most in nonprofits over the last 20 years have been technology, clearly, and probably number two, marketing. Do you think we're getting what we want from those expenditures, though? I mean, it feels like we have to spend money just because if you don't, you're going to fall behind.
That's right.
But are we able to really capitalize in the way that we want to on those expenditures? I sometimes question whether we are at the Wise Giving Alliance. I mean, we can't stop spending, but it's also a question of, can you really get what you're expecting from that? And how do we think about that?
Ooh, those are really spot on questions that we think about and wrestle with too. I mean, especially now that we're on the cusp of like this AI revolution too, right? Like, how do we think about technology in a way that helps our work, but is also socially responsible and doesn't create harm? And also, like, we have to ask with marketing, it's like, what's the end, right? What is the so what of the marketing? Is it to burnish the credentials of an individual leader? Or is it really to change the narrative around a certain issue? And I think that those things can sometimes get really conflated and murky. And I think we see that both in nonprofits and in philanthropy. And so I think we got to be really careful. Like, it's such a crowded marketplace of ideas. Everybody wants to be kind of telling their story. And so the way that we approach our own story and, looking for donors and partners who care about kind of the substance versus the spin, I think can be a challenge. And that's something that I think we think about every day, right? We are a research organization. And so we're all about substance. And sometimes substance doesn't necessarily win out in a world of buzz. Not that it's about like winning and losing, but it's really about kind of how can we achieve our mission that we really believe in, right? So yeah, I mean, these are the really salient topics, and, sticking to our values really matters, finding the right people to collaborate with, and, really communicating in a way that is helpful and digestible to our audience, I think are all things that come to mind. I don't know, Phil, if you would add anything.
I mean, I think more broadly, and maybe this is not exactly what you're getting at, Art and Grace, but it's what's in my mind, which is that more broadly, we've got a problem in communicating effectively about nonprofits and the sector, right? Like, because we see declining rates of household participation in giving, which are, you know all that data well, but, for your listeners, 2/3 of American households were given to charity 2 decades ago, and it's under half now. Trust is still high relative to, big business and government, but that's not saying a lot. And I am stymied by the fact that folks don't seem to appreciate the sector enough. They don't seem to appreciate all the nonprofits that have made our lives better, given us things we take for granted as good, from vaccines to clean air, which not everybody has, but clean water, and, all of that. But we don't keep it top of mind. And Grace has heard me say this before, but like, we do a little icebreaker. I hate icebreakers, but one that I do ask people to do, they don't have to do it. But when we do this like orientation with new staff here, is tell me about introduce yourself and tell us about one nonprofit that made a difference in your life. And, we'll do this with new employees. So 4, 5, 6 people in the room, people who started over the last quarter. And the stories are incredible. They're incredible. Someone will say, well, I grew up in a pretty poor neighborhood and underinvested in, and somebody noticed me in middle school, and they got me connected to a program that gave me support through high school to get to a selective college where I got a lot of financial aid. And if it had not been for that program, I don't think I'd be here now. Somebody might say, well, I volunteered with a nonprofit that worked with children with disabilities, and I learned so much about them and about myself, and it changed my perspective on the world. Or an environmental organization, whatever it is, inevitably somebody cries, right, telling the story, right? Like, that's how profound the impact of these organizations are. And we can all think of those individual organizations, but in terms of the public debate about policy, for example, I mean, independent sector and National Council for Nonprofits had to fight in the spring of 2020 just to get nonprofits included in the PPP program because people just overlooked them, right? Our lawmakers. Somehow we're not breaking through about why this sector matters, its beautiful diversity, and the heroism of the staff who do hard work every day. And, this is harder work than working in an equivalent sized business. It's the toughest challenges that folks are working on.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned a word that I can't ignore, and that's the whole issue of diversity. And I know you've been doing work on that for some time. What are you seeing on that front?
I mean, I'll start and just say, because I worked very directly on this research, and then let Grace jump in, that in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's murder and the racial justice reckoning, we saw folks engaging, and I said this, I think, last time I was talking with you, Art, I won't repeat it all, but engaging donors and foundations in a different way. We saw huge pledges. We saw folks looking at their strategies and the connections to systemic racism. We saw folks looking at their processes. And now we've seen, obviously, backlash, right, societally. The demonization even of the words diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is mind-boggling that folks are having to defend the use of those words, right? And I think it's hard to tell exactly what's going on. We see some inspiring examples of foundations that have absolutely doubled down. They're super committed to racial equity. They understand that the quest is far from over. They understand the history and present day realities of systemic and structural racism and what it has meant. And they're fighting for a world in which your race or your zip code predicts nothing about your life outcomes, right? And we're a long way from that. But we see others who are retreating, worried about their boards, worried about lawsuits. And we've all been watching this Fearless Fund case, which just settled because they didn't want it to go to the Supreme Court for fear of the precedent that would be set nationally. Legal counsels are nervous, so we hear all that too, and I'm worried. And Grace, I know you think about this a lot too. I don't know what you would add.
Yeah, I mean, I'm worried too, and I think that there's a good case for folks on either side of the political spectrum to also be concerned, right? Like we talk about on the right, folks really care about donor intent, right? There's a long conversation about why it matters, what a donor's intention is. And I do think that in this case, there's a conservative argument that donor intent, like if you would like to support under-resourced communities, traditionally marginalized communities, that donor intent should also be honored, right? And so I feel like that is not really part of the conversation, and I think it needs to be. And I think it is really interesting. We do hear these high-profile cases of people being essentially hunted down by lawyers like Edward Blum's team around their DEI practices. But we also know in some survey work that we've done that a lot of folks are either quietly or loudly staying the course, like Phil is saying, right? So I do feel like something fundamental did shift. And what I would love to see is that the people who are staying the course outnumber greatly the people who have retreated, like Phil was saying. I think we've learned and seen too much to back down now.
And I think one of the bright spots in this area is that it's not simply about what's right. It is about what's right, but it's not simply that. I follow what Goldman Sachs is doing because my daughter works there, and they have a program called 1 Million Black Women. And their plan is to invest $10 billion over 10 years to improve the situation that Black women face. And it isn't because they just feel like giving money away, because it's not really a philanthropic program. They went into the data and found out that by investing in Black women, we can grow the economy substantially, and we can obviously improve these communities. So for them, it's a business case. It's not simply, oh, let's do something for Black women because it's nice. Now, I wish they would see that too, because it is about fairness and equity, but it's also about business. It's about the future, I think, of our country in so many ways. So, the pendulum swings. We saw the pendulum swing back in the 70s when, affirmative action was attacked as this terrible thing. And then, we saw it move in the other direction in the 80s and then back again in the 70s, in the 90s. So it goes back and forth. But, I think we're heading over time, at least, in the right direction because we can't go anywhere else. The country is growing increasingly diverse while the power is still primarily invested in one demographic. That's going to change too over time. So, and they're not going to be able to survive or succeed unless they put people in places and give people opportunities to do what they're able to do. So I think we're going to move in the right direction. But right now, I think it's just we're in that messy period where there's still a significant number of people who don't get it, don't want to be a part of it, think it's something to be afraid of. All of that, I get that. But I think in time we'll get there. So that's my hopefulness. It's my hopefulness. So let me jump on another subject that I'm really interested in getting your thoughts about. And that is this whole issue of debate. Phil, I know you are one to debate people on damn near everything.
Perhaps not my greatest quality.
But that's what we should be able to do, right? We should be able to have these tough conversations, even with people who we disagree with on a lot of key areas, but we should be able to talk. We should be able to debate. We should be able to learn from. We should be willing to have our minds open to hearing, right? Is there space in our society for that right now? Are we heading in the right direction on that, in your opinion? And by the way, can our sector be leaders in creating that space for those kinds of conversations?
To your last point, can our sector be leaders? The answer is yes. I mean, I think that there is tremendous power when people who are in relative positions of privilege make concerted efforts to set that privilege aside and connect with people who are really different than them. I think that we cannot underestimate how powerful that can be. So I would say absolutely. And there are a lot of donors and funders who are working on things like political polarization, class differences, the state of our democracy, all of that. So I feel encouraged by some of those efforts. And I absolutely think that the debate is key. And it's actually been really wonderful to work with Phil over the years just to see how he does engage in those conversations. He's not afraid to kind of call people out, but he doesn't do it in the way that, cancels them or shunts them to the side, but really, with a lot of logic and forthrightness. And I think that's actually a good way to approach it, right? We should not be afraid. I mean, this is a point Phil makes often. It's like people in philanthropy in particular should not be afraid of like losing some of that privilege to have some of those conversations, right? Like what are we afraid of losing when we're already in such positions of power? And so, I think it's a really important conversation. So Phil, I'm now really curious how you're going to answer.
Well, I think I would first say, Grace, that you have been a real force within CEP for ensuring that we are not just, talking to the choir. That, for example, when we hold a conference, that there's ideological breadth of perspectives, both in the audience and also up on stage. And I've been a little bit dismayed to hear indirectly, nobody ever said it to our faces, that, for example, people didn't like, some people, that we had a plenary in which we had, a right of center funder on the stage, even though the topic was literally bridging ideological divides to work together. But somehow there were some folks who thought it would be better to have no ideological diversity on this panel. So we got to be careful that we're not just trying to say, well, you got to pass this purity test to be in this conversation, because we're not going to make progress on important issues if we don't broaden, the coalition of people who care about the issues. I think the tricky part, and Grace and I have talked about this a lot, and we talk about it with Eric Liu on one episode of our podcast, who is incredibly thoughtful founder and CEO of Citizens University and focused on issues related to civic participation. And that the risk is this, when in the effort to bridge ideological divides, do you go too far and normalize extremism, right? So what are the boundaries within which we want to have conversations? And how do we make sure we don't inadvertently platform or legitimate, hate or things that are just over a boundary? And people are going to set those boundaries in different places. I don't have the answer, right? But this is a conversation that we have all the time at CEP, and I have seen times where I think, boy, that was a mistake for an organization to give a platform to that person, because I do think that they're over the line in my estimation. And then I've also shown up at events in philanthropy events where it seems that the goal is just to perform your righteousness in front of people, right? Not to actually broaden or engage with people who have a different perspective. And that's not so great either. I'm not equating those two things, but they're both examples of counterproductive behaviors. But I think, to Grace's point at the beginning, the sector has an important role. And one of the reasons I think volunteering is so important is that often when people volunteer, they find themselves working shoulder to shoulder with someone in their community. And it might take them 6 months of friendship before they even realize that they've got different political perspectives or ideological views. And then they start to understand each other in a different way.
See, it's that I think, if you look at our organizations, because we don't often like to talk about where we are politically, and that's fine, but if we were to ask people in our organizations, they'd be all over the map, because we don't ask them, well, what's your party, when we go to hire people.
Right.
So we don't ask them those kinds of questions. So, but the issue's hunger. We want to fix hunger. We want to help people get homes. Everybody's working on that issue. It seems to me, just like any kind of sporting event, we say sports is a great equalizer, because if you can play, we won't care where you came from. There's some issues with that, of course. But the bottom line here is, if people can work together on an issue and solve problems, they might be able to work together in other ways, right? Mm-hmm. So we'll get to know each other. So I think our sector has tremendous opportunity there to bring us together. Well, look, I know we're probably at time, but this could obviously go on quite some time talking with you both. But what I want to do is just wish you a great 4th season on your podcast, Giving Done Right, which, by the way, was named, Phil, for a book you wrote of the same title. So I want to put that out there for people to remember. If you haven't gotten your copy of Giving Done Right, you should go right out and get one and learn. You really get into Phil's head then if you want to.
It's a scary place to be, but thanks, Art.
So I wanted to just thank you both for doing the work that you do for our sector and for the podcast, and for being here.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Art, for having us. We love the work that you do as well.
Yeah, Art, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Appreciate you.
Well, great. Well, listen, this is a weekly show, as I mentioned up front. And for those of you who are listening for the first time, I hope you will subscribe to our show and to Giving Done Right. And by the way, if you want to support the podcast, you can do that by going to our website, give.org, and we will certainly put that money to great use. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you back here next week.
You've just listened to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. To listen to our other interviews, visit heartgiving.podbean.com. That's heartgiving.podbean.com. Subscribe to our show on major podcast platforms. The thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are the views and opinions of the guests, not those of the BBB Wise Giving Alliance or program affiliates. This podcast is for information and educational purposes only and is copyrighted with all rights reserved. This podcast is protected by Podbean's terms of service.